Hi, Melody O, and welcome to Author Nation. And today we have an author interview. I'd like to introduce Colin MacArthur. He was born in Canada, but he lived nearly half his life in the UK. He's always had an interest in writing and the written word. He has been published as a photographer and has had one-man exhibitions of his photography both in Canada and the UK. He feels strongly that sharing his experience in this book, French Toast, might help others cope if they find themselves in similar circumstances. And just before we introduce Colin, I'm going to read a little bit of an online book review. This is from the onlinebookclub.com, and they said, in his bittersweet memoir, French Toast, Colin MacArthur shares his relationship with Christine, a victim of childhood abuse. Christine's inability to deal with her pain despite MacArthur's commitment to their on-again, off-again relationship exemplifies the far-reaching ripple effect of sexual abuse. The book traverses themes of unconditional love, abuse, sexuality, LGBT issues, and acceptance. MacArthur dedicates the book to Christine and all those who have suffered abuse at the hands of another. And I have to say that's, you read the back of a book and the description that's written there, but then you read the description written by someone who's just reviewed the book, and I love that. And this reviewer goes on to say that they were a little bit leery about reading it because of the subject matter. I guess they were afraid that it might get graphic. But then I won't read the whole review. It's long, it's beautiful, but they do go on to say, and let me find the quote. After reading the sample on Amazon, I was drawn in by MacArthur's eloquent writing style. He masterfully portrays the abuse Christine suffered without explicit details. I just think that's a beautiful, beautiful review. And so that was me talking a lot. I really want to welcome Colin MacArthur. Colin, welcome.
Thank you.
Hi.
Melody. Hi.
So could you tell us a little bit about your background?
Okay, I have a very eclectic background. As you mentioned, I was born here in BC. My father died when I was 12, and Mum took us all off to England, where I soon had a stepfather, and I was one too many mouths to feed, so I got pushed off into the Royal Navy at 15 years of age. I was there for 4 years. Working on helicopters, electronics. I came out of there and contrary to what I was told, my qualifications in the Navy didn't transfer to the civvy street. So I spent a couple of years selling electrical goods, TVs and fridges and sewing machines, all sorts of stuff. Then I was a short order cook for one season for my parents in their takeaway food shop. And then I went and worked in the public health lab where I was cooking for cultural media for bacteria and viruses. So I spent 10 years in the hospital service, 2 of those years in the operating rooms. Fascinating, I really enjoyed that, but the pay wasn't going to ever allow me to have a family in a house. And so I went back to school and did a 4 years electronics course. Ended up making tape decks for NASA way back in the 80s. $250,000 tape decks, but now you can buy the same thing from Western Digital and put it in your shirt pocket for $30 or something. And I moved back to Canada, moved back to Vancouver in 87. So yeah, the book starts in England, ends up in Canada, ends up back in England.
Yeah. And I'm always amazed when I ask authors, about their backgrounds, how varied it is. And it's just, I just find that amazing. And then my next question is, so you haven't always been a writer, right? Like, when did you start writing?
I haven't, but in my 20s, I used to write poetry and short stories. And I was actually a member of Somerset Writers Club back in England. And so we we wrote and read our stuff to each other, and I did send off a few short stories to a couple of magazines. But yeah, there was a bit of interest there.
Yeah. So you have been writing for a long time before you wrote this book.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me about this book. Like, why write a book?
Well, if I thought about writing a book, it would have been science fiction or a fantasy book, and I had stories bouncing around in my head sometime that I thought one of these days I'll write this story. But then life got in the way, and I sort of in this relationship, and when it ended, this was with Christine, and she said, "You should write my story one of these days."
Interesting.
So finally, that's what I sat down and did.
Yeah. And she didn't want to write it.
No, she said, "I'm not the writer, you're the writer," and yeah.
Yeah. So you wrote it with Christine's blessing and encouragement.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So do tell us now. Let's turn to the book. Like, well, tell me about the book. What is it about?
The book is my memoir, but it is my memoir as a vessel to tell Christine's story.
Yeah.
And it's a story that during our relationship, basically as she felt safer and she started talking to me about her past and telling me her life story. And yes, I just thought it was a story that deserved telling. And so this book is how I came to learn her story and my method of sharing it with the world.
Yeah. So really it's about your learning her story, interestingly enough. So it's about her story, but kind of overarching that is like your experience of it, your experience of learning that story. So in that kind of cocoon, what would you say is the promise of the book? So if I'm in the bookstore and I see this book and I pick it up and I look at it, and I look at the front cover and the back cover, and what promise are you making me with this book?
It has a new front cover now, but that's beside the point.
Yeah.
The promise of the book basically is that you're not alone. If you had an abusive childhood, if you grew up with a sexually abusive father, if you're struggling to come to terms with your sexuality, you're not alone. There are other people that have gone through this. And Christine thought she was the only one for a lot of years until she started discovering from other sources in the world. So,
and that's really important, because I think that's true. I think a lot of kids who face abuse, particularly severe abuse, I don't mean the regular, smack on the behind here and there. Wasn't abuse when you were a kid and I was a kid, might be considered abuse now, I don't know. We're not talking about kind of those experiences, but when we have fairly severe abuse, very traumatic experiences, we think we're the only person in the whole world, and somehow it's our fault and we should keep it a secret, and it's shameful, right? Yeah. So once the book was out in the world, did Christine read it? What did she think of it? Can you tell us that, if you're willing to just talk a little bit about kind of how she felt about it?
Christine was the first person anywhere to actually go out and buy the book. So she's back living in England. And as I told her, the publishing date and how it would be available. And she was the very first person to be in a bookshop, basically the day it came out, before I had any copies in my hand. She had a copy of them. And so there were a lot of things in the book because there are flashbacks in her story.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of things in the book that I was concerned that she would pick up on and say, well, this isn't how it happened, or that wasn't the case, or, but no, nothing. Even the parts of the story where I had to use a little artistic license, nothing. The only criticism she had of the whole book was it made me sound flaky.
Oh.
And I never actually called her flaky.
Yeah.
But then if you read the book, there's a lot of push-pull, and yeah, so that was her only criticism.
Okay. Oh, okay. That she felt she came across as flaky, but I don't think was your intention. I guess it can be hard to get into depth on one issue when you're really focused on something else, right? It's a bit of a balance. You can't write a 1,000-page book and bring in every aspect of her. So that I can imagine that would be a challenge. So you supported her for many years, and she's supporting you in the book. That's lovely. Yeah. So I'd like to turn a little bit to talking about your author journey. So this is your first full-length, novel, memoir, manuscript. What was it like? What was your book journey like?
Long and at times tough.
Yeah.
A couple of years after she left me, I said, yes, I should write her book. So I sat down, writing it out longhand. I guess it was fairly early days of computer stuff. And so I'm writing it out longhand. I had this girl typing it up for me. And I just got to parts of the book which were too painful, too raw for me to deal with. It had only been a few years. And so I put it all away. And I just left it for, I don't know how many years, I don't remember. And then I got it out one day and I thought, I should work on this. And I read through what I'd written, promptly tore it all up, threw it away, and thought about it for a while. And then little threads of ideas started coming into my head, almost as if I was being fed the opening sequence of the line of the book, or how this paragraph should fit in with the story. And by then I'm sitting down at the computer typing it myself. So it was probably 10 years or more in the writing, maybe 15, but with a big gap in the middle between starting it, tearing it up, and getting back to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's a difference between writing your memoir to kind of sort through it, to heal, to find, that release, and writing your memoir for readership, for an audience, for the public. And I what you just said, I wrote it and then it hurt too much and I walked away and then I came back and I tore it up and I wrote it again. I think that's a very common story for people who write memoirs that are difficult and challenging and painful. I believe that your experience is not outside of the norm for memoir writers. So tell me what your biggest challenge was in writing the book. And it took a long time. It was really, really raw. But from an author perspective, what was your biggest challenge?
I didn't have the experience of writing. I left school at 15 with no qualifications. My when I was in school, my English teacher ended up disappearing halfway through my first term there, and her place was taken by this French woman. And I don't think her focus really was much in teaching the class. So, yeah, I could have done with better English skills.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, what did you do about that? What did you do to overcome that?
I wrote it in my own words. I wrote it basically, I guess, as I talked.
Yeah.
And I had to get it down on paper first. And then I went back and went through parts of it. But it was never going to be readable until I got it to the editors. And
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you make a good point. I mean, there, you know, it's if you have a story and you have a message that you want to get across, whether you are, you know, have a PhD in English or you left school at 15, that doesn't really matter. What matters is that you have something to say, you have a story to tell, and you have a message that is important. Yeah. And if that's true, just getting it out in whatever form you can, and then allowing somebody else to support you through the process of taking what you've put down and helping you mold it into something that is a saleable book that other people will read and get that message from. I mean, that's the job of a good editor, right? So, you know, I think the lesson here is if you have a story but you don't think you're a writer, don't let it get in your way. Just get it out somehow. Get the help you need to get the story out, because these are important stories and they need to be told.
Until it's written down somewhere on paper or in the computer, nobody can edit it or give you suggestions or anything else. While it's roaming around in your head, it's not going to get any progress until you get it down on paper.
Yeah. And don't worry about what it looks like the first time. Don't worry about it. It can go through, you know, several revisions before you release it to the world. Yeah, excellent. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about editing, because I remember you told me a story about one editor you had who while editing the book made a comment about a choice you had made during the relationship. And I remember you telling me that story, and I remember as an editor, as a developmental editor, being horrified that somebody would have an opinion around the actual like content of the your choices. Because when we're writing a memoir, this is first. I mean, you talked about writing it and it hurt so much and walking away from it. And I mean, this is when we're writing memoirs, especially about difficult things. This is our raw soul that we're putting out there, and these choices have been made. So for anyone, especially a professional editor, to say, well, you know, shouldn't have said that, you know, that must have, can you just tell us about this?
I needed an editor.
Yeah.
And so I looked at the Federation of BC Writers and the Canadian Association of Authors, and I found this professional editor that was available, and I did warn her about the content of the book being abuse, and she said that's not a problem. So I paid her a retainer, and I gave her the first third or first quarter of the book on paper, printed it out for her, all double spaced so she could write in the columns, and off she went. And I didn't hear anything for a while, and then finally I started getting stuff back from her, and there was a lot of really good advice in there, which I did follow. But there was also a lot of comments in there. So one of the difficulties in this relationship was dealing with Christine's parents. And in places where she read this in the book, she is writing instructions on what I should do to deal with Christine's parents. Well, this is 35, 40 years too late.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of suggestions in there and a lot of questions. Why did you do it that way and not this? And
yeah,
a lot of comments that I wouldn't do it the same way. And so there were some really positive suggestions, which I did follow, and I did go through and make the first, second, third draft. But it still wasn't in a state where, and she dropped out. She sent back what she'd done, and she told me that, she couldn't basically do any more for me. She wouldn't charge anything more, and she dropped out. So very luckily, I had two friends who both offered to do the editing. And I wasn't totally convinced because I didn't know enough about their backgrounds to know whether they were capable of editing the book, but I sent a copy off to each of them. And I got back very positive feedback, a lot of good instructions, a lot of help. And I followed both of their sort of instructions, reworked the whole thing, and there was still a few little bits and pieces when it ended up in front of the proofreader just before it went to press. But the two friends cost me nothing, and without them, it really would be tough to read it. So
and they did this without judgment. Yeah, and I think that's the point I want to make. Professional editors are not there to judge the material. They can choose to edit it or not edit it, but they're not there to make judgment on the person writing the book or the characters in the book or whatnot. And so that's, when you're looking for an editor, that's not what you want. So based on this experience, what would be your advice if somebody's written a memoir and it's really close to their heart and they certainly don't want to be judged? What's your advice for finding a good editor? Would you ask certain questions next time, or?
Yes, I asked some basic questions. I mean, I did warn her that there was sexual abuse in the story, that there was probably two. And she said, oh yeah, that's no problem. But I think I should have looked a bit deeper into her history and find out a bit more about what she's edited. Maybe ask other published writers where they went. I still think that the Federation of BC Writers is a good place to look. Canadian Authors Association. But I was very new to that, and so I didn't know enough to search through their websites and look deeper.
Yeah. So wherever you live, there is an editors association or a writers association or an authors association, and you can go there and you can look for editors. And if you're writing a memoir, I think it's important to find an editor who knows how to edit a memoir, because editing a memoir is very different than editing, a fiction book. You can't, it's parts of the story that's the story. And although, and in memoir, you don't have to give every single fact, you do need to be truthful. And you certainly, as an author, don't want to be judged for it, right? So, Will you write another book?
I don't think so.
No? Are you done?
There is so much work involved, and certainly don't write your book if you're looking for rewards. You would need to maybe write a lot of books before you start sort of percolating through. And I do have a story that roams around in my head, and it's very different. It's definitely not a memoir, and it is a little bit of a time travel thing, or at least a story where one woman finds she's accidentally going back in time, and she's continuously worried about being trapped in the past, and she's equally worried about being trapped in the here and now, because she wants to go back to this time that she's found by chance, and she wants to come forward and spend time with her parents. So, but I don't know. I think about it, and I've done a bit of background research on the timeline for it. We'll see.
I think you have another book in you, Mr. MacArthur.
Ah, dear.
So, okay, French toast. Tell us, where can we buy French toast?
Pretty much everywhere.
Awesome.
So Christine walked into a bookstore in Essex in England and bought her copy, and it arrived quite sharply. My sister-in-law walked into a bookstore in Yuma and in the south of the States and bought a copy.
Yeah.
My sisters in the West Country in England bought copies. So paperback, any bookstore should be able to order you one.
Yep.
And the ebooks, Amazon, Kindle, Apple Books, pretty much anywhere, everywhere, yeah.
Good distribution, well done.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Would you like to read just a little bit to us? I would love to hear an excerpt. And if there are any warnings, just give us a bit of a warning if there's anything.
Well, it's a little sad section. I want to read a flashback to Christine's childhood, and this is basically I marked the page.
I love that. I know it's here somewhere.
And
I say
now
that
I'm not
every
finding
day.
it.
So this is a flashback about Christine. She's younger in this scene. She's dealing with her parents.
Yeah, she's young. She's probably about 6 years old. She had, at some point before this, when she was younger, she had a couple of foster kids that she played with, and they suddenly disappeared. And that was never explained to her. They're gone, that's it. No more foster kids, goodbye. And so it was just her parents, and her dog Brandy. And so she had to figure out for herself as a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, why the foster kids had disappeared. So I'll just read this section.
Mm-hmm.
Chrissy liked it best when it was just her and her dog, left to play on their own. Sunday was not her best day, but for some reason that afternoon they were left on their own in the living room. They played chase. Chrissy made a big fuss of Brandy, and then she ran around in circles. Brandy loved to chase. Around the room, in and out from behind the easy chairs, then around the coffee table, and Chrissy would turn and chase Brandy, who wasn't quite sure what to do with this part of the game. So it was always far too easy to catch. Suddenly, as Brandy turned in one of his excited spins, his tail caught the teacup, which sat on the corner of the coffee table. Over it went with a loud clatter, spilling the dregs into the saucer and onto the table as it fell to the carpeted floor. Chrissy was there in an instant. "It's all right, Brandy. It didn't break," she said, reassuring herself more than the dog. With that, the living room door flew open and her mother suddenly appeared, just as Chrissy replaced the cup in the saucer. "Why don't you look what you're doing?" her mother bellowed. "You careless girl." "It wasn't me, Mum. Brandy knocked it over with his tail," Chrissy explained. "Don't lie to me. You think I don't know what you get up to?" Then with 2 quick steps, Mrs. Wilson was there and swiped Chrissy across the head with the back of her hand. There was a tear welling up in Chrissy's eye from the shock and the pain as well as the confusion. She tried to hold it back. It was Brandy, honest it was. "Get out of here," her mother demanded. "Go and play in the garden, and I don't want to see or hear from you until dinner is ready." With that, Chrissy took the lead from behind the door and headed down the stairs. "We will go to our special place. Come on, Brandy," Chrissy whispered, bending to attach the lead to Brandy's collar. "Then no one will find us there. We will walk up into the garden, and when no one is watching, we will slip into our hiding place." So they walked to the top of the garden and back down again, several times, carefully checking the windows to see if anyone was watching. And Chrissy was sure it was safe. They slipped into the woodshed and under the table. Only then did she let a few tears roll down her cheeks. "It's all right, Brandy, it's all right," she told him. "It wasn't your fault either. I don't blame you. Besides, it didn't even break." "They're not my real parents," Chrissy continued. "One day my real parents are going to come back for me. You'll see, just like my foster sister and brother. But you know that. Someday soon they will come for me. And we will take you with us too, Brandy. I promise. We won't leave you behind."
Oh, that's beautiful. And what a moment that's, where, whether the dog did it or the child did it, it's a mistake, right? The poor thing. Yeah. Thank you for reading that for us. I just, as we wrap up, I know that you are born in Canada, but you have lived in the UK. So in honor of that, I put the what is it? The London Eye behind.
Right.
It was built in 1998, and that's in London, where I'm sure you've been. But I also noticed, but I also noticed that behind you there are some photographs, and you're a photographer.
Yes.
And so I'm assuming there's some photographs behind you that you have taken.
Yes.
You've won awards and you've done your own photography shows. So I just wanted to tell people, I didn't take this photo behind me, but it is the London Eye. But Colin has taken the photos behind him. They are of beautiful women. Colin, thank you for joining me today. I really, really appreciated it. And thank you for reading and talking a little bit about editing a memoir and how challenging that can be. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, you have a good rest of the day.
And you. Thank you.
Bye.
Great. Bye.